Spontaneous generation theory. The spontaneous generation theory proposes that all living organisms are created and born from non-living matter. People who believed in the spontaneous generation theory believed that flies and other small animals arose from mud at the bottom of streams and ponds by spontaneous generation. The first traces of this theory can be found back in 300 BC, when Greek philosopher Aristotle started writing about the first ideas related to spontaneous generation. He believed that life was created from non-living matter as it had pneuma, or vital heat. He gathered his evidence, which was the sudden appearance of animals from environments which had none before, such as fish in a new puddle of water which had no life previously. This theory only kept getting more popular. People started claiming that they saw frogs appear in muddy banks on the Nile River in Egypt during their annual flooding. People also claimed that mice came out of grain stored in barns with thatched roofs. People started believing more and more about this theory. They thought that pieces of cheese and bread wrapped in rags and left in a dark corner were able to produce mice. This explained occurrences such as maggots growing in decaying meat. The first scientist to talk about this theory was Jan Baptista van Helmont, who was a Flemish scientist in the 17th century who claimed that mice came from rags and wheat kernels left in an open container for 3 weeks. Francesco Redi was an Italian scientist who was the first to doubt the spontaneous generation theory. To prove this, he conducted an experiment where he left meat in 6 containers. 2 were left open to the air, 2 were covered with gauze, and 2 were tightly sealed. After a couple of days, he noticed that the flies had been attracted to both the jars that were open and the ones that were covered in gauze. And later, he found maggots in only the meat with the open jar, but not in the other 2 pieces of meat. He also found maggots on top of the gauze on the jars covered with gauze. Because of this, he concluded that maggots were the offspring of flies and not the product of spontaneous generation. John Tarbell Needham was a notable scientist, English naturalist, and Roman Catholic divine. In 1745, he published a report of his own experiences on spontaneous generation. He did this by boiling broth infused with plant or animal matter for 30 minutes, hoping to kill all pre-existing microbes. He then sealed the flasks. After a few days, Needham observed that the broth had become cloudy, and a single drop contained numerous microscopic creatures. He argued that the new microbes must have arisen spontaneously, which means he probably did not boil the broth enough to kill all pre-existing microbes. He explained the new presence of life as spontaneous generation. Psychologist Lazarus Spallanzani wanted to disprove the spontaneous generation theory, so he created a similar experiment as the one Needham had made. He put broth in sealed and unsealed jars, which was infused with plant and animal matter. Spallanzani's results contradicting the findings of Needham. Heated but sealed flasks remained clear without any signs of spontaneous growth, unless the flasks were subsequently opened to the air. He published his findings in 1775, claiming that Needham had not heated his tubes long enough, or hadn't sealed them properly. Though his results were convincing, Needham had the support of influential French naturalist Buffon. As new science continued to come out, people wanted more information on what was going on, so the French Academy of Sciences offered a prize for research that would throw new light on spontaneous generation. Louis Pasteur was a French chemist who wanted to participate in the event to prove the theory wrong. In 1858, Pasteur conducted an experiment where he had left open jars covered with cotton, and odd-shaped jars which had a twisted open tube coming out of it. After sterilizing them by heating them for an hour, he left them for a couple of days. He noticed that the only jar with microbes was the one that was left open. He later checked the cotton on the second jar, where he found it to be full of microorganisms, suggesting that the exposure to a broth to air was not introducing a life force to the broth, but rather airborne microorganisms. This way, he was able to demonstrate that any microorganisms that developed in suitable media came from microorganisms in air, not from the air itself, just like Needham had suggested. In 1868, he won the Alhambert Prize from the Paris Academy of Sciences, and in 1864, Pasteur articulated omne vivum ex vivo, which means life only comes from life. In 1876, English physicist John Tyndall devised an apparatus to demonstrate that air had the ability to carry particulate matter. His apparatus worked with light, which under certain illuminated conditions would tell if there was matter, since it reflected light. His apparatus could tell if it was pure. No organisms were produced in pure air that was introduced into media capable of supporting the growth of microorganisms. Those results and Pasteur's findings ended the spontaneous generation theory. In the 1920s, the Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin and a few other scientists suggested that life may have come from non-living matter under conditions that existed on primitive Earth, when the atmosphere consisted of methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen. He believed that energy supplied by electrical storms and ultraviolet light may have broken down the atmospheric gases and created new molecules. It was later proven right, and they produced amino acids and proteinoids.